During the pandemic, we saw a lot of people saying, if you are in the middle, then you are far right. And I was like, okay, nice fallacy. I don't play that game. Why is it that you have to choose one side or the other? And I think that has led to ultimate chaos and dysregulation within our nervous system, our endocrine system, our immune system. And so what you're talking about, how do we move health forward, starting with yourself, starting with your beliefs?
Dr. Jolene Brighten, what a pleasure.
Yes, we've been hanging out all week, but now we're going to record the conversation.
Right, and all new material, nothing that we've discussed around the dinner table.
Yeah.
Well, here we are in California, in Laurel Canyon, and really I bring that up to kick off the conversation because this is sort of the home base for a lot of the early movements that really propelled us around our interests. I know you're a native Californian as well. So, you know, these issues like healthy food and farmers markets and alternative and integrative medicine, they had their home, their origin, their provenance here in California. And they were very, very connected to progressive politics, right? So, you know, it was really the left that were these anti-establishmentarians, right? They were the people fighting for civil rights, fighting against the Vietnam War, fighting against DDT, part of the environmental movement, et cetera. And during COVID, we saw a strange migration around these issues and the people espousing them. There was sort of a horseshoeing with the kind of left progressive health movement and the kind of libertarian right movement that started to create these very strange bedfellows around health and some of these issues that are so endemic to health. And then now we're sort of in this world where sort of Bobby Kennedy sort of soldered that horseshoe together and made it a circle. And it's very difficult in the health sphere now to know where to stand because, like you, I have often conflated healthy food and alternative medicine with like sane climate policy and women's rights. I've seen that all in a sort of a constellation.
Yeah.
And now that constellation has broken apart. And so how are you kind of navigating the current wellness sphere where so many of the wellness modalities have now moved to under kind of the right?
You know, it is a really weird time to be alive and to be witnessing all of this. I think, you know, for you and I, it's been decades of our life. I look at how I used to go to the vegan cafe, dollar vote for organic produce. And people are like, you're crazy. Organic produce isn't worth investing in. It's so expensive. And I have always operated under the assumption that within a capitalistic market, your dollar vote matters. And as we've seen, that's been true. As we purchased more organic, then that expanded things. It made it more accessible to other people. So here I am, like eating organic, caring about our food supply. I have worked in, WIC programs, SNAP, senior nutrition programs. So I've had like this long history of really caring about food and about, this was a time when food as medicine wasn't a thing, but we would talk about the importance of nutrition, and mainstream medicine was very much like, no, that doesn't do anything. Your food doesn't do anything, which is so laughable to think like, yeah, everything I eat becomes me, but that doesn't do anything. So, I spent a long time being classified as this like liberal, hippie, crunchy mom. Like I grew my own food in Portland. I grew my own herbs, would make tinctures and salves. I had chickens, and all of this was seen as this like really fringe liberal way to be. As you were saying, in the pandemic, things started to shift. And what's so interesting is how just in the last year, we had an election, so everything gets a little wild during election. I started getting attacked online, people saying like, you're part of the far right, you're a trad wife, Firstly, if someone wants to be a trad wife, that's their business. And I think it's very problematic to put a woman down because she decides, like, this is the route I want to take with my life. But I was like, I have a big D, little r in front of my name. Help me understand how that makes me a traditional wife. Like, I think anybody who pays attention to me online would not assume that. But it was really kind of almost like a bullying tactic of like, let's call you names. Conservative became like a name that was like being dropped on me. And I'm like, I take issue with using that as a derogatory term. If somebody has conservative ideas and beliefs, like that doesn't always translate to bad person. But the way language started to be manipulated and twisted, and the thing that I put out online many times was, what's changed? Because it's not me. I haven't changed.
Right.
But the idea of what it means to care about your food, to question medicine, like, I mean, really, pharma was very good in terms of their marketing and manipulation tactics during the pandemic. And I think something I'm very good at is pattern recognition, and to see how they started wielding this, like, trust the science, don't question the science. Anybody who questions the science, they're a conspiracy theorist. And I'm like, no, people who question the science are scientists. And a lot of conversations were happening behind the scenes. So things that we can't say on social media, that people won't say on the podcast, that we don't say in public spaces, but talking to colleagues, scientists, researchers, everybody being on the same page of being like, what the heck is going on? So I think, one of the things I really settled with is that I am confident in who I am, and my actions have always spoken for themselves. And I have a track record of being Dr. Brighten, who thinks what Dr. Brighten thinks and who will change her mind when new information comes. And so anytime someone steps in and wants to put a label on me or decide that, like, one way I stepped wrong and wasn't perfect on the internet is the totality of my entire life to which I'll be judged on, I really sit back and I'm like, you know what? I'm confident in who I am. And we all can have a lot of words on the internet, but the actions are really what we should all be measured by. And I've got decades of a track record of being this person who cares deeply about the health of everyone else. And it's why I produce like so much free content, because I think we have gate-kept health so much in the United States because it's such a profitable market. And that is something that I'm like, I really wanted to end. And I will say, that is something I think the right is trying to do, is to stop the gatekeeping that's happened around medicine and to start, they say they want to decouple, right, the influence of pharma, of big food. We do have a problem, right? I mean, when I was getting my nutrition degree, we were talking about how, the head of the USDA passes all these laws, and then they get to go jump to this big food corporation and be a CEO, and they get all these bonuses. Yeah. FDA, same thing. They push all these drugs through. They jump onto that drug company's board, and now they've got stocks in it. Like, it's very, very problematic. And this was very much considered liberal, out there ideas, and now it's being talked about again in a bigger light. I feel like because it's become so political. And now suddenly it's like, well, this is a conservative idea.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating to watch. I mean, and certainly, yes, this collusion that you outline and the perverse incentives associated with the kind of revolving door between public health agencies, big food, and big agriculture and big pharma. I mean, this is incredibly corrosive to human health, period.
Yeah.
And I think that idea is one that we can all rally around, but it has seemed to be more adopted and more amplified now by the political right. And what I wonder is how authentic that truly is. When I see some of the, turn on Fox News, which I don't often do, but I'll see it enough in my social media feed. Or listen to Tucker Carlson's podcast or Joe Rogan's podcast. And I am hearing just over and over again, some of our colleagues being interviewed and talking about these very issues. And I can't help but wonder if it's somewhat of an opportunistic play on the right because they have positioned themselves now as these sort of compulsive contrarians to all institutions of liberal democracy. So let's go through them. They're very, very critical of institutes of higher learning, right? So, look at what happened in the wake of the encampments at our Ivy League schools, right?
Yeah.
That elicited just a massive uproar from the right. Okay, let's look at also mainstream media and the critique of mainstream media and how they're essentially captured. So mainstream media is also corrupt and needs to be disrupted, et cetera. But then, of course, the pharmaceutical complex, food complex, even government. I mean, it's very interesting to watch now an administration that is governing, but that actually doesn't truly believe in government. And it's disassembling all of the agencies that long, helped to essentially create a very imperfect, but at least functional system. So do you think that the motives on the right are legit and authentic around health and food, or is it just kind of fit into a portfolio of anti-establishment thinking?
I'm very skeptical. And so I'll explain why I'm skeptical, but what I will say is that I do believe the voter base, so the individuals, absolutely care about this. As we were talking about, there's these concepts in health, like good metabolic health and things that we've talked about forever, right? To the point where it's like yawn for us, right? We're going to talk about circadian rhythm again, that are completely new to some people in the United States, and it's life-changing for them. And I do believe that what the politicians did is they identified that this is something our constituents are very interested in, and this is what the majority are. So we need to actually pay attention. I think that speaks volumes in the, actually serving your people. However, I do think in some ways that it's a political play. It is something that, you and I talked. I had the opportunity to interview Alex Clark on my podcast. Right. And I asked her about that as well, straight up, do you feel like you're getting played? Because to me, there's too many contradictions happening in this administration right now. And it's confusing to hear, and again, this comes back to actions are the measure, not the words. And so you hear things about how much they care about health. Then we see removing legislation that protects children from excess lead exposure in pipes. How do you reconcile that? We know that's going to drop their IQ. We know how detrimental this is to a developing human, and yet you're taking away EPA regulations. You say you care about fertility. Well, I hate to break it to you, but the biggest threat to our fertility is the environmental toxins. You care about heavy metals in our food. What do you think fracking is going to do? We are seeing these contradictions happen. And we are seeing things where they start to move forward in positive ways, trying to make efforts towards our food supply. But to me, it's completely short-sighted. You cannot change our food for the better if you do not change our environment for the better. And, some of our friends, as they go on and they're representing MAHA, they use this analogy that I hear over and over. If you have a fish in a bowl and the water is dirty, you don't treat the fish if it's sick, you change the water. And I'm like, if you understand that, then how are you reconciling with the fact that we are going to start seeing trees mass cut down? We're going to start seeing us digging for oil, mining, talking about coal mines opening again. You start seeing all these things, and it's you clearly understand the impact of the environment. And to think that we are separate in any way, it makes absolutely no sense. The other thing I would say is that I really am the entire, we're going to go after ultra-processed food. Arguably, yes. I have laid out the argument for people because I watched a lot of the MAHA people just talking about, we need to take away ultra-processed food off of SNAP, so food stamps, if people don't know what that is. And it's true. That does have to happen because it is because of ultra-processed food being covered by SNAP that the food industry was able to create food deserts. So food deserts exist because us as taxpayers are subsidizing not only through SNAP, but also through agriculture, corn, soy, like the lowest quality crops. Like, okay, and listen, I'm a Latina, so I'm a fan of corn. However, like we have seen the food industry has decimated the farmer. I've always argued the farmer is part of the healthcare team. We have to take care of our farmers, our local farmers especially. But if the initiative there is that we need to get rid of ultra-processed food. We need to start looking at getting out food dyes and cleaning up the food supply. Why did the biggest lobbyist of seed oils and processed food get appointed to the head of the USDA? And, some people argue well, maybe she'll change her mind. Maybe, however, actions have spoken. So what actions is she putting into place now that we'll see that change? So to your point, I feel like the people genuinely care, and that's why they invested. Why is this the first time that we have seen a politician, like a presidential nominee, start talking about healthcare and food system and all of this stuff that people have been talking about for decades and caring about? And the truth of the matter is, and people call me a conspiracy theorist for this, but it is documented. These politicians have been in the pocket of big food and big pharma, and often you can follow the donation amount that they received and then the legislation that they put into place. And so I think it brought a lot of hope. If I was a politician, it was a really, really smart play. Is it genuine? We're only going to know by the actions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think just yesterday or the day before, I saw Planned Parenthood get gutted.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
Which people think they do so many abortions. And I'm like, do you know how much breast cancer they detect?
That's it, I know.
Do you know how much breast cancer they detect or cervical cancer? We're actually seeing a backslide for the first time in the U.S. where women are starting to die of cervical cancer at higher rates. This is a very easy cancer to detect and to treat. And now we just took the number one place where people can access that. Tell me you don't really care about women's health without telling me.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many areas there. I mean, the Department of Education, of course, now getting decimated. What that's going to do for around kids with special needs. The Office of Land Management now being run by an oil and gas executive to essentially open up our national forests to potential drilling and mining, et cetera. So there's a friction here. And I think we're going to really see the friction is more sort of conceptual because, Republicans and Republican administrations are generally deregulatory in nature. They want to open up regulations, right, so business can thrive. But to tame big food, there needs to be really a regulatory mindset. So we're going to, I think, it's going to come to a head, at least I predict that it will, where there will be this sort of deregulatory lens through which Republican administrations operate, coming up against sort of a regulatory need that HHS is going to have to reel in big food. And I don't know how that's going to play out. So,
well, you know what I think is interesting? I almost don't want to say this because I feel like I'm giving away the plot. Is that what I would predict is going to happen is that if this administration, if these politicians were put in place with all these promises of health, start negatively impacting health, right? Because there's a lot of these people who identify as MAHA who are very much we're holding out hope and we're trying and we're working toward this. And I think what will happen is that if they don't make good on their promises, they don't realize they thought they leveraged influencers to get power, but what they really just created was a hydra. And so if they do not follow through, they're going to actually have this entire online base that is strong, that has, we know conservative influencers have far more followers than what we see on the liberal side. I think what will happen is they will rise against, and then you'll see them trying to deplatform, trying to cut off the head, and you'll see two rise out. And the more they start to control and try to control, the more they're going to see pushback and all of that. It was very interesting to me because not having been so I lived in California, and then I lived in Portland, Oregon for 12 years. So in a lot of ways, it was I was just surrounded by liberals, right? It wasn't getting and it was really eye-opening to me, I think, during the pandemic of like how much I wasn't thinking for myself when it came to evaluating conservatives. I was, because of just my surroundings. I was seeping in and I was hearing these things. So, having now spent more time talking with conservatives, because I realized like, who wins when we stay divided? Well, why have we never been able to move the needle in this country? So big food, big pharma, these mega corporations are who wins by keeping us divisive with one another. Like, we're never going to improve anything or solve problems by yelling across the aisle at each other. So I want to sit down and have these conversations and try to understand, what are people thinking? And it's very interesting to me because I never realized that, and conservatives will tell you this, we were manipulated for a long time by big food, who told us, oh, these liberals are telling you, don't eat these, ultra processed foods. They're trying to take away your freedom. They're trying to take away your freedom.
Right. Yeah.
And to hear, and I really respect this, to hear conservatives say, we were manipulated, we got played, we were wrong. That's like a very hard thing for most humans to do, but we were wrong. And now we're trying to step in here. And what's interesting is that they feel also like they get pushed out, polarized, that they can't be accepted in because they have conservative ideas. And that I feel like in some ways they feel like they had to co-opt and take this movement for themselves because they were never going to be let in. But they realized how important it was. And a few of them said to me, like, I approached like so-and-so and said, hey, I believe in what you're doing. I'm going to send my audience to you. Like, I want to collaborate. And they're like, ew, yuck, no, get away from me. You're conservative. And I'm like, like, who does that actually serve? Your ego? Like, what is the reason for this?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, as I started to analyze this landscape, I started to actually look at, at legislation and policy. And, Bernie Sanders actually has a really, really good bill. That
we could have had Bernie Sanders. I will pine on that for the day I die.
So he has a great bill to address childhood diabetes.
Yeah.
It has numerous Democratic co-sponsors. I think John Hickenlooper from Colorado, Cory Booker. Cory also has, and Cory's been a champion of this for a very long time. Cory also has a bill around school lunch programs, et cetera. These were bills that have been sitting in the Senate for a year or a year and a half. Even in this state, in California, a lot of people have a lot of problem with Governor Newsom. But if you actually look at the record, he's already issued executive orders banning all these red dyes, et cetera. He was early to actually administer SNAP or allow for SNAP benefits to be used at farmers markets, for example. Early investments in regenerative agriculture in this state. Lots of other initiatives around women's health in the state of California. So, all of these issues were central to liberal thinking, but somewhere along the way, heterodox thinking around issues got essentially eliminated from the Democratic Party. And so, and I think we saw this very much around the Black Lives Matter movement, that, if you didn't espouse kind of the Ibram X. Kendi sort of anti-racism program, then you were out of the tent. If you have sort of any kind of middle-of-the-road approach to abortion policy, you're pretty much out of the tent. Because it used to be, safe and rare, and then you're out of the tent. You can't say that about abortion anymore. More and more, this tribe got essentially illiberal in terms of the marketplace of ideas and what was acceptable public discourse.
Yeah.
Why? Where did the left lose the plot there?
And I was I also asked the question, did we ever need to make these left or right issue? And is that part of why like we've had so many problems. And it is something that it was kind of crazy because during the pandemic we were all unwell. Whether you actually got COVID or not, I think that we're going to look back in history and it is going to be judged very poorly what we did to people during the pandemic. You took incredibly social creatures and you isolated them. So many mental health issues cropped up. Like there were just so many problems. And I think we can say that and also say no one gave us a playbook to a pandemic. Like nobody knew what they were doing. So in a lot of ways, we were doing the best we can. I think that also medicine has to own everything they got wrong. They're like, mistakes were made, move on. I'm like, no. You say sorry. Like, did your mom not teach you how apologies work? Like, you got to say sorry. You have to own it, name it, talk about what you're doing better, talk about how you're making a better plan for the future because we did go through it. So no one in the future, with the documentation we have, should ever have to go through this whole well, I think we need to stand 6 feet apart and you can never leave your house on these days. I mean, I was in Puerto Rico and we went through a period of time where we were allowed to leave our house 2 days a week only to procure food. And if you were found outside your property at any point, $5,000 fine, 6 months in jail. Like, are you crazy?
Wow.
And I, at the time, was like, this is insanity. But we could not ask questions. We were no longer able to ask questions. So, I think, I think in a lot of ways, the pandemic really bred a lot of issues. And, I even think about now our children. I see teachers online talking about kids are 2 years behind and parents aren't doing their job and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, did you not realize what happened for 2 years? Yeah. For 2 years, suddenly everyone had to be a homeschooling parent? Like, of course kids are behind. And what is that going to do in the long term? So, there's a bit of a deviation talking about but I think we have to recognize that so many of these issues were really born out of this. I told you, last year I went and spoke at a conservative women's conference. And this was something that I really debated because, and I realized the big conflict for me was the idea in my head that I had about these people is that I had assumptions about what it would be like and assumptions about what I thought I knew. And I was like, I don't actually really know these people. And I need to see things for myself. But also, if a conference invites me to speak to 16 to 26-year-olds who predominantly live in red states. Those red states do not have medically accurate sex education. They have propaganda and inaccuracies that lead to a lot of problems. And they said, come speak about women's health. We want you to teach medically accurate sex ed. I asked them straight up, anything I can't talk about, anything. They're like, whatever you want, full freedom. And I was like, this is an opportunity. And my team, they were like, no, don't do it. This is bad for your image. And I'm like, but hold up. I'm a doctor. Docere means to teach. Why do I get to say because I think you have these political ideas and I don't agree with them, therefore you don't get access to information. Who am I to do that? I'm not. Yeah. And what was so interesting about being there is I really thought conservative women, because we saw what the media says, that they're very anti-abortion, they're anti-IVF, they're anti-birth control, they're anti all these women's, health issues that we are very concerned about these days. And that was not the case. Women coming up to me being like, I'm going through IVF. Thank you for sharing your IVF story. We're us having a dialogue about it. Women talking to me about I've been on the birth control pill. I'm not ready to come off. How do I support my body on it? Having real conversations with all these women. And what was so interesting to me is that I asked women, because they would bring up I was always considered myself liberal. I'm like, how did you get here to this conference? How are you now part of the conservative movement? And they said, there's no place left for me anymore over on the left. Mm-hmm. Being a mom was one of the biggest things that women were citing. Yeah. They did not feel that you could be a mom and be liberal anymore because of the way that people talked to you, the way that people treated you, the way that people talked about the choice of motherhood. It's also something that I'll say that I was like, man, do you realize how grating this is women who were pro-abortion, and I get you're coming from a place of big emotions, I have no judgment about them using the language they did. When our emotions override our frontal lobe and we're in desperation, we're going to say things that we feel will get us heard. But saying things like, it's just a ball of cells about women's babies. And I had women that when I had shared something about having a miscarriage and Trump was coming into office, I had all of these comments from women being like, you should be so lucky that like you lost that baby, and that, or didn't even say baby, that ball of cells. And that like, and the way that they were talking to me, and I'm like, okay, I get this is about you. And I feel like at my age, I can separate those things out, but I'm like, that's really unkind and harsh to be saying, you know, just because you have your feels about what's happening with abortion, you have to also hold space that there's this other end of the spectrum. But that was really, I mean, my jaw dropped hearing that, yeah, well, because I want to ask questions and question medical decisions being made for myself or my child, I don't feel like I have a place in the liberal community anymore because I'm just supposed to trust, and if I don't, I'm a conspiracy theorist. Hearing, you know, the other, so there's the piece about being a mom, there's asking about medicine, and then there was food as well. And that if you question ultra-processed food, you criticize ultra-processed food, you're an ableist. You are, like, right? The left has created so many names to call people, and they've really lost the nuance in the conversations.
Yeah, well, and I think they've also expanded the usage of those terms to apply where they don't really apply. I mean, it used to be the worst thing that you could ever call anyone was a racist.
Yeah.
Right? But when you start to hurl that word around as something, as a term that is used through the lens of every single decision that one makes, it actually stops. It doesn't have its pregnant meaning anymore.
Yeah.
And I think this is what we saw. You know, I write a newsletter for Commune, and I was attacking a lot of incendiary issues in 2020, and I started to build a lot of relationships, and I started having a lot of conversations with people on the right. And, you know, there was this particular woman from Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, which is a sort of rural area in Pennsylvania. And I had a very, very long, involved back and forth, and it eventually culminated in a long Zoom conversation. And she was, you know, she basically broke down her life. She's like, Jeff, I'm a single mom. Okay, I'm working 2 jobs, minimum wage. My grocery store is the 7-Eleven, right?
Yeah.
Basically my town has been boarded up. My main street has been boarded up. 10 people I know have had family members die from fentanyl, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Okay? And she basically goes through this litany of descriptors of her human condition. And she's like, and at the same time, people are calling me privileged. Let me just tell you, Jeff, I don't feel privileged at all.
Yeah.
Nor do I feel responsible for anything that my great-grandfather might have said or did. I'm just really trying to make my way. And I feel like so shamed, you know? And it really hit me, like viscerally, hearing that. And I was like, oh man, we, like on the left, need to stop looking down our nose with indignation on people just because they have separate political beliefs or that they were raised within a certain culture.
Yeah.
And we need to actually start having more open and compassionate conversations.
The whole privilege thing is so bizarre to me because it makes such an assumption that you know anything about someone's life. And like anytime, so I was talking about food stamps and people were like, obviously you don't know poverty. You don't know anything. You're so privileged. And what was interesting to me is I'm like, well, I said I worked in WIC, I work in SNAP, I worked in senior nutrition programs, I've worked in feeding homeless people, I worked 2 years in a homeless youth clinic. I'm like, I have dedicated a good portion of my life to the underserved population. And I'm like, furthermore, my parents were teenagers when they had me. I was born to 2 teenagers who tried to give me the best life that they could. But my first house literally had a tin roof, a concrete shower with a pipe that shot water out at you. Like, we always had like frogs in there, which is awesome as a kid. But like, when I look back, it's like, wow, like we, like I didn't come from a lot. Like my mother's family had immigrated to the United States. It's so funny because it's like I don't feel like I have to tell these things, but even during the pandemic, people are like, oh, well, you have white privilege. And I'm like, well, I'm actually a Latina. And they're like, well, you're not very dark. I'm like, oh, I don't know if you know this, but white Mexicans exist. Like, what is your idea of what, like, and like also Latinas, like abroad, like there's a lot of us. Like, I don't know if you know this, but, and I go through these things of like, this is my life. I've been on, food stamps before. I'm autistic, so I have a disability. Like I am a Latina, and like when I tell people this, like you're assuming this. They're like, well, you should put that in your bio, or you should make sure you caveat that in your post. And I'm like, no, I don't need to every time I talk about anything, like dredge up all of these things about myself to be like, oh, and here's like all the ways that like I haven't had it easy, therefore listen to me. It's such a ridiculous thing, but this notion of privilege is weaponized. And I think that's really what was problematic, is that cancel culture got crazy wild. It was a wildfire. And people are like, oh, it's accountability culture. I'm like, is it though? Because when we hold people accountable, people should be able to apologize, grow, change, evolve from that. But really cancel culture was like, we're going to destroy your life. And people did have their lives destroyed. We're like, there were just arguably some really bad takes and people really misbehaving on the internet. But did that mean that they should lose like their business, their home, their marriage, like all of that? Like, and we saw a lot of that in the pandemic. And so the question was, were these terms being used as a way to move society forward, to improve growth? Like, what was the end goal? Because what it really appeared like to me is that we've weaponized all of these terms to make sure that you know that you're on the outside. And it's almost like putting a target on someone's back to say, free game, attack them. And I think in a lot of ways, because all of that had happened during the pandemic, like we find ourselves in the current political situation that we do because people, had to join camps and leave, but also there was no more unity anymore. And it was also something that what was really, I just was surprised by this. I am really glad that I went to that conference because, one, I had my ideas about who these people were. I will say at one point, Laura Trump came on stage. It was a full-on Trump rally. I was like, I am in the wrong place. I am in danger. And it's very much something, though, that I'll say that as I have conversations with conservatives, they very much are like, so here's what happened at this conference. The Alex Clark, who had invited me to come and talk, I was like, do they think that, like, because I wrote Beyond the Pill, I'm like anti-birth control or on their same side or something like that? And when I talked to her, she's like, thanks for coming and doing this. We know that you are not religious. We know that you're not like, you don't believe anything we believe, but we believe that you can really help women. And I was like, what? Like, oh my gosh, because anytime there's a hit piece in liberal media about me talking about birth control, they're like, she's like this religious extremist and all this stuff. And I'm like, why? How do you get that from me? But, in having these conversations, what I have been really shocked by is how often women who are conservative are like, I know that you have totally different ideas. You disagree with me. When I interviewed Alex Clark, I was like, how's this going to go? Conservative women were like, it was so refreshing to see people who absolutely have different beliefs, absolutely have different ideas, be civil in a conversation together. And to see conservative women who I think, like, the liberal narrative is that they're the closed-minded, like they're the closed-minded ones. And yet to see them being like, I know that everything is totally like, different in terms of like your belief system from me. However, I can see what is good in your message that I can take from myself, and I can value that piece while also saying the rest of her is not for me.
Yeah, and candidly, like the left actually used to be pretty good at managing this collection of strange bedfellows, right?
Yeah.
Like they used to have to essentially keep environmentalists and union members under the same tent, right? And coexist and find compromise and ways to disagree without being disagreeable. And it seems like that spirit, at least, has moved to the right. And in some cases, it actually continues to make me uneasy, even though actually I approve of that overall spirit of being able to actually have a big tent. And I mean, I recently saw, I think it was called America First. It was a conference in Phoenix, I think. And there you have like Vani Hari, Food Babe, or whatever, and other people.
Who was considered a crazy, crunchy mom, right?
Right, total crazy, crunchy mom. But then the headliners on that bill are like the swamp creatures of QAnon, like Michael, Michael Flynn and Steve Bannon. I mean, people essentially associated with some of the most pernicious and corrosive kinds of ideas, in my opinion, and who are kind of central to really the dismantling of all of our really kind of the best parts of our institutions, et cetera. So there we have, these bedfellows, like within the same conference, somehow coexisting. And I really, really admire and applaud your willingness to go to places and address conservative women with ideas that are central to health and that will bend the arc of their experience. And at the same time, the misgivings that I have around these conversations are sometimes centered around the idea that we are sanitizing or laundering in some ways the images of people that are up to some pretty nefarious things.
Yeah.
And how we thread that needle between, bringing really, really high quality, stringent information to people across the political spectrum without saying like, oh yeah, Tucker Carlson, you're such a good guy.
Yeah.
And thanks for being on the right side of history.
Yeah.
Despite your rants on replacement theory or your text threads about essentially fooling the American people into thinking that the 2020 election was stolen. So this is the tension I feel.
Yeah, no, I don't blame you. And I think it's something that, I really sit with this. So after I interviewed Alex Clark, I had brought up the glaring issue that they were not addressing many of the women's health concerns. And I will always argue that mothers are not only the creators, but also the protectors of the future of our human race. Like these are the people who have such a huge impact. And so we have to be taking care of women's health. Afterwards, they've been reaching out to me. And so we've been having conversations about different aspects, like them being like, we want to remove formula. Like we want to get women breastfeeding. I'm like, hey guys, think about why are women bootlegging formula from the EU? And also, do you know about how Nestle is the whole reason why we don't have maternity leave? And they're like, hold up, what? Yes, because they lobby so we don't get maternity leave, so moms have to go back to work early. They get super stressed out. They lose their milk supply. They have to buy formula. And they have been very receptive to these initiatives and to these ideas of like, hey, it's not enough to focus on getting rid of ultra-processed food. You have to start like incentivizing, like double the dollar if people buy produce. Like make it so that the convenience stores want to start bringing in fresh produce. Like we have to have education. We have to have facilities. And so I've been surprised by how open they are to these things. But yet at the same time, I've had an invitation like, join Maha Moms, and I've been really sitting on the fence. I'm like, I'm happy to like collaborate for the greater good, but do I want to tie myself to that? Because I never want to be tied to a political movement or an idea in which that the expectation is I accept everything. And I am being very candid with them. Like, I am not going to go with the flow. I'm going to question everything. I'm going to be problematic. Like, are you ready for me to be problematic? And I think as we look at like, we need to look at what our goals are in this country. There's certainly many things we've already highlighted that we disagree with that are happening politically that are problematic. Do we let all of that then influence the other aspects? Like, do we relinquish being part of this health space because now we're being name called as conservative? I'd love to hear from you. What do you think the way forward is right now?
Yeah. I think what I really admire about how you're approaching it is that you're like, I am honest and I stand for what I stand for, and I'm not going to be co-opted by any movement and compromise my principles. So let's just like say
Sleeping
that,
at night is important for your health.
yeah. Right. So let's like lay that up as just a foundational way to move through the world. And so if we can agree there, I think for me, I'm interested in a whole broad variety of social, cultural, political issues, much farther beyond fluoride or raw milk or red dye 40. You know, those are part of them. But I also really deeply care about sane gun policy, around sane climate policy, around really progressive women's rights policy. So for me, I want to recapture the issues around health and bring them back into that constellation, into that portfolio. Wherever that portfolio sits politically, whether that's the right or the left or independent or some new party that comes up, that's probably where you'll find me, you know, because these are the issues that most align with my values. And does that mean that because most of those things sit within the portfolio of the left, that I'm not going to go and talk to people on the right? No way. You know, I think we can all learn from each other, but I think we all need to stick to our, I'm not going to use the word guns in this particular case, to stick to
You're
our...
like, no guns, but keep your guns.
Yeah, right, to stick to our principles. And,
Yeah.
you know, honestly, I felt very lonely for the last few years because the middle path, which is also a reflection of my spiritual beliefs, but also spills into my political maneuverings, can be incredibly lonely, honestly. And it's also not particularly algorithmically preferenced to have a nuanced, kind of middle-centered approach towards politics because our attention economy or our persuasion economy operates through hyperbole and sensationalism and scandal and anything that's going to tickle human negativity bias and create more outrage and more fear. And no political party has a monopoly on that. They all play that game. They're all playing the fear and outrage game. And that is not a game I want to play.
Yeah.
You know, I want to play the parasympathetic nervous system game, you know. You know, sometimes like I think about, you know, sleep, for example. This is something we always talk about, circadian rhythm and getting light in the morning and getting foundational sleep and how fundamental that is to health.
Yeah.
And then I, you know, talked to some of my friends on the right. I was like, how many people do you think are up at night because of this administration? I mean, this is sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of people. If you're a veteran, if you're any kind of federal employee, if you're an immigrant, you're probably not sleeping, right? Okay, we know that stress is upstream from all of these different health conditions. This administration operates by chaos and flooding the zone.
Yeah.
You know, we are stressed as a country all of the time. And of course, news media plays on that stress to amplify what is the new crazy thing. Was it Greenland today? Is it Panama? Is it Canada's the 51st state? I mean, every day there is something to essentially hijack our amygdala.
Yeah.
Right? And so, you know, I think that we need more sane conversations that pull people towards the middle. I mean, if you look at like human physiology, you know, the key to health is homeostasis, right?
Yeah.
We need homeostasis in our body politic, not just in our own physical bodies. And generally that's found somewhere in the middle in some sort of dynamic equilibrium, you know? The body, like, you can do a lot to the body it's hard to throw off its pH balance, right? You know, it usually self-regulates right in there like 7.35 or something like that. We need that same mechanism for our body politics, something that can bring the thinner edges back towards the tree trunk. And so that's the role I want to play.
Yeah, I think, you know, during the pandemic, we saw a lot of people saying, if you are in the middle, then you are far right. And I was like, okay, nice fallacy. I don't play that game. What I think people in the United States need to do more of, definitely travel, talk to people outside the U.S., start getting news outside the U.S., because what was really eye-opening to me, so splitting our time in Mexico, being at dinner with friends who are Mexican, who are British, who are like from all these different countries, with this like very international dinner that we're having, and the politics came up, as they do, because the U.S. is like all up in everybody's business these days. And it was so interesting to hear how many of these women said, in your country, I would be considered centrist, but we're liberal. Everywhere else in the world, liberal. And they're like, but I would never want to be a liberal in the U.S. because they're absolutely extremist. And I was like, say more about this. Like, I want to hear about this. Yeah. And what's interesting is one friend of mine, she has multiple masters in women's health studies. She actually works in basically women's policies. And she's like, what is happening in the U.S., like with what liberals are doing and how they're talking about women, is really undermining women and it's hurting women. And it was so interesting to hear this outside perspective. And so I think it's not just talking across the aisle, but within the US, we tend to think we are the greatest, the best. We get all of our news in the US. We're like inundated with this. And it has been always so eye-opening to me to hear from people who are on the outside looking in, and to hear them say these things of like, why is it that being like balanced is such a bad thing? Why is it that you have to choose one side or the other? And I think that has led to ultimate chaos and dysregulation within our nervous system, our endocrine system, our immune system. And so what you're talking about, how do we move health forward, starting with yourself, starting with your beliefs? I'm very much of the mindset of like, we leave this world naked, but I do believe we can leave with our integrity. So figure out what that is, figure out your balance, start working from that place, and drop the labels and drop the idea that like you have to be aligned with one thing in totality. And you can say, I agree with this, but I'm also going to disagree with this, and have those hard conversations.
Yeah, amen. Well, thank you for doing those. You know, I really do applaud you, like having those conversations with like Alex Clark, because I think it represents not just bravery, but really the solution to what we're looking for. I mean, I do believe still in the quote unquote American dream, but I think that it is these very stressful conversations that stand between us and that dream, that place that our hearts really imagine as possible. So thanks for doing them.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having this conversation with me.
Yeah. Well, I think this can hopefully model conversations that other people can have just in their own lives. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you'll love this one too.